Now, some of the history, and again, please don't believe me, go out and find it. If you look out for historians of Europe, European historians in Victorian times, they give you some very interesting ideas about Rome at that time, and they also kind of give you some very interesting ideas that kind of, it almost told the future of 2008. In Victorian times, 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, historians, scholars, academics were talking about the British Empire. In the 1800s, actually probably from the 1500s to the 1800s, it was very clearly the British Empire, and that was their heyday. And, you know, they're proud of the British Empire, so that's cool. But Europe was keeping an eye on other parts of the world too. And some European historians were wondering about the rise of America, and they were starting to make some early connections to the rise of America and the brutal armies of the Roman Empire. Let me give you an example. Hitler was born in the 1890s. He served in the First World War, and then of course he rose to power in the Second World War. You might not know that Hitler, for instance, was a huge fan of the way that the United States had treated Aboriginal peoples. The way that the United States treated Aboriginal peoples is that they had adopted a manifesto called the Manifest Destiny, which was that America was determined by God himself to, that the indigenous peoples, the people who lived there, were going to be eradicated in face of this wonderful empire that was growing. And I'm going to get into this in a little while later, that the brutality of American military just destroyed the indigenous peoples. And Hitler thought that was great. Hitler wasn't the only guy. Point is, Europe was keeping an eye on early America by the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they were comparing early America to the Roman Empire. Get a load of some of these descriptions. Let's see here. Sir Harry Johnstone was likening, quote, the governing community of Rome to a Neanderthal variety of the modern democratic civilized state. So he was likening Rome to a Neanderthal version of early democracy. And then he went on to talk about it, comparing it to Neanderthals. And he said early Rome was, quote, a shambling, hairy, brutish, but very cunning creature with a big brain behind. Very interesting if you think about that. A big, hairy, dangerous mother. Cunning, brutal, with a big brain. Scary. Now, I had promised that I was going to make a point out of these three characters, and now it's time to start doing that. So, by the time that we're talking about now, 50 BC, Rome is big and getting bigger. The armies are wicked. The absorption of the military and the economic were it was highly successful. People didn't have any choice. The assimilation was highly successful. Now, as Rome began to expand and expand and expand and take in the wealth of all of the countries that it was conquering, the Senate, the government of Rome, which of course was in Rome, began to read some of the writings of ancient Greece, very much like Macedonia did. By this time, Rome was looking back in its kind of leisure time after gigantic wars, and they're doing well with trade. They're incredibly rich. They've got huge commerce. They've got all kinds of goodies from all parts of that world and spreading. They had made inroads to China, I think, by that time. Now, for our purposes, one of these people was beginning to be read very widely by the 1st century. And the person who was being read very widely was Aristotle. There's a very good reason for that. So I'm asking you to sort of rewind a bit and try to place yourself in early Greece, which Rome was kind of looking up in its leisure time. Socrates. Socrates, all 3 of these characters are very famous and probably recognizable to you. Without getting into a big philosophy thing, I think we can talk about 3 wide areas these people represented. Socrates didn't actually write anything, but it was Socrates' custom to talk in public places. Socrates is remembered today for his ability to poke holes in other people's philosophies. It started what's still known in the universities as the Socratic method. And what Socrates said, he said, learning how little we know is the best way to get knowledge. I would almost write that down. See if we can remember it. Learning how little we know is the best way to obtain knowledge. A person should ask questions to consider the limits of what you really know. So if we take that into a modern context, if Socrates was alive in Calgary today, when we picked up the newspaper and we read about the East Village, or we read about homeless shelters, or read about, I don't know, domestic violence, or I don't know, gang violence or whatever, we pick up a newspaper, and we've fallen into a terrible trap in modern times, is in the way that we put an awful lot of faith in our media. You might not know that the media is controlled by a very finite number of people, very finite, 3 people to 6 people, depending on who you read. And these people determine what's in the news and what's newsworthy. As a kid growing up in the 1960s, I used to read Jimmy Olsen, you know, Superman's pal in the comic books, and Lois Lane. I used to think, boy, yeah, journalistic integrity. Journalism and media is highly controlled. Now, Socrates would be a troublemaker in 2008 in Calgary, because Socrates would say, you know, back up and think about what it is that you think you know. And what you think you know, you should question it. And that's what Socrates would say. Okay? Now, Plato was born just really soon after Socrates, and they were both kind of bringing their ideas into philosophy pretty close to the same time. Socrates was Plato was a guy who believed in beauty and harmony and human relationships and all of these wonderful things. And Plato said, you should take hold of your lives. Most of the things that distress you, you can avoid. Most of the things that dominate you, you can overthrow. Let's think about that again in Calgary. If Plato was alive in Calgary, he would be a troublemaker, because he's saying, you know, look and listen and think. You know, the things that oppress you, you can overthrow. This is what Plato said. Now, if we think about that, it gives an awful lot of power to disadvantaged groups, whether it's battered women, or native people, or Sudanese immigrants, or God knows what. He's saying, you know, take control. We can do things. Don't just accept it. We can do stuff. You can see why Socrates and Plato got into trouble. Now, compare these 2 characters to Aristotle. Aristotle came along later. In Plato's old age, when Plato was old, Aristotle was young. And Aristotle, get a load of this, he favored slavery. Aristotle favored constitutional kings. Aristotle, quote, believed that it made sense for the times to have absolute monarchs.